Welcome to note set number 3, one-step equations, multiplying and dividing. I'm going to put a number 3 at the top. Before we begin, on these notes though, we need to talk about understanding what multiplying and dividing is. So briefly, when I say 2 times 5, 2 times 5 is 10. The reason why it's 10 is because it means I have 2 5s. So if I have 5 plus another 5, I get 10. So 2 times 5 means how many times I add 5. It's also how many times I add 2. If I added 2 5 times, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So it doesn't matter how you think of it, but it's how many times you add something. Multiplication tells you how many times you add something. So when I say 2x, and this is a term, one term, it's a number next to a letter, what's happening between them is that they're being multiplied. It means I have 2 x's being added together. So if I tell you x is 5, then 2 5s would be 10. So that is, in sum, what multiplication is. Division is also multiplication. It's just backwards multiplication. So if I say 10 divided by 5, it's like saying I have $10 and I'm dividing it amongst 5 people. So if I think of 5 little buckets, I have 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Each person, or each bucket, has 2. And that's how division works. But note that 2 times 5 was 10. So it's just backwards multiplication. In the same way, if I did 10 divided by 2, it's just 5. Because 5 is the other number I need with 2 to multiply to 10. So with that being said, fraction, something like 1/5, what it means, the top number you multiply by, the bottom number is what you divide by. So 1/5 means multiply by 1, divide by 5. So 1/5 of 10 means multiply by 1. Well, 1 times 10 is just 10, so you don't even have to think about the multiply by 1 part. Really, it just means divide by 5. So 1/5 means divide by 5. So 1/5 of 10 is 2. In the same way, half of 10, so that means times by 1, but again, that part doesn't matter as much because it's just 10. So it means 1/2 means divide by 2. And so 10 divided by 2 is 5. Now, we're going to move on and start these notes. So example 1, this says 2x, meaning 2 times something, is 8. Well, 2 times 4 is 8, so x is 4. However, to solve this mathematically, you draw your wall at the equal sign, you separate the 2 halves. On the left with x, we have 2, and 2 is currently being multiplied to x because there's nothing between them. So the opposite of multiplication is division. So I'm going to divide this 2 away on both sides. Well, 2 divided by 2 is just 1, and so it's just 1x, but I don't have to write the 1. And 8 divided by 2 is 4. So in this case, x is 4. Example 2 is a fraction this time, and it says 2/3 of something is 10. So there's some number, when you divide it by 3 and then keep 2 of the parts, you're going to have 10. Well, the answer is 15, because if I divide it into 3, they're each 5, and 2 of those parts is 2 5s is 10. So x is 15. However, if you didn't know that, you draw your wall where your equal sign is. Because you have a fraction, it means times by 2 divided by 3. The first thing you want to do is to get rid of the bottom, because the bottom part's what makes it a fraction. So the bottom part says divide by 3. Well, to undo dividing, you need to multiply it. So I'm going to put everything in parentheses. I'm going to multiply by 3 over here and by 3 over here. Well, there's two ways to think about it. Because I undid it, I did times by 3 and there's a divide by 3. You can just think, oh, well, they cancel each other because you undid it. And you're just left with 2 x's. Another way to think about this is that if you did 3 times the 2 on top, you'd get 6. But then when you divided that by the 3 on bottom, you'd go back to 2. So you could either think of it as it cancels, or times by 2 to get 6, divide by 3 to go back to 2. But either way, what happens is the bottom disappears, and you're just left with what's on the top, the 2 with the x. Then on the right side, you have 10. You're still timesing it by 3 because you did it on the left, and you have to do it on the right side to keep them equal. And 10 times 3 is 30. Well, x still isn't alone. There's a 2 in front of it. And it means it's being times to it because there's no plus or minus sign. And to undo multiplication, you have to divide it away on both sides to keep them equal. 2 divided by 2 is just 1x, but I don't have to write that one. And 30 divided by 2 is 15. So now that we've mathematically solved that x is 15. Over here in example 2, it says negative 3 times some number is 24. Well, negative 3 times negative 8 is positive 24. Because 3 times 8 is 24, and negative times a negative is a positive. Therefore, so x is negative 8. To do this mathematically, I draw my wall. This is times negative 3, so I'm going to divide both sides by a negative 3. With negatives, people start getting confused. They will see a minus 3 and they think they want to add it over. The trick here is that there's not a plus sign between them or a minus sign between them to separate them. They're just right next to each other. The 3's right next to the x, which means they're being multiplied. So to undo multiplication, you need to divide it away. And you need to make sure you are dividing the negative away too, because you don't want the negative to stay there. So you need to divide both sides by negative 3. So negative 3 divided by negative 3. Well, 3 divided by 3 is 1, and a negative divided by a negative makes it positive. So it's just positive 1x. And 24 divided by 3 is 8, and the positive divided by the negative is a negative. So x is 8. On example number 4, this says x divided by 2 equals 5. So, to undo division, well, we're going to start, what number divided by 2 is 5? We know that 10 divided by 2 is 5. So, x is 10. But if we didn't know that logically, to mathematically solve it, you draw your wall. To undo division, because it's x divided by 2, you multiply both sides by the number on the bottom, which is 2. Well, 2 divided by 2 cancels and just becomes 1x equals 5 times 2, which is 10. Next, see this fraction, this is x divided by 2, and then the next one says 1/2 x. Well, remember 1/2 just means divide by 2. So these all actually are the same. So I'm going to add this note to the bottom real fast to say that 1/2 x is the same as x over 2. You could think of it as x times that one is just x on top, like that, and then it's being divided by 2. Alright, for our next example, it says half of something's 8. Well, we know that half of 16 is 8. So x is 16. But if you don't know that logically, you can draw your line at the equal sign to separate the two halves. This says 1/2 to get rid of my fraction. I get a times by the bottom. On the left and on the right to keep it equal. 2 times half is 1, because you could do 2 times 1 is 2 divided by 2 is 1, or just think that the bottoms cancel and you're just left with the 1x, but you don't have to write the 1. And 8 times 2 is 16. For the next one, it says 3x's divided by 4 is 6. So 3 of something, when I divide it by 4, is going to give me 6. Logically, I know that 3 times 8 is 24, and 24 divided by 4 is 6. So therefore, x is 8. So x is 8. However, if you don't logically know that, you can draw your line at the equal sign. To get rid of the bottom of a fraction, because you want to get rid of the fraction, since it's dividing by 4, you can times both sides by 4. 4, 4. Since you're undoing it, you could just cancel, and you're left with the 3x's. Or if you want to multiply it in, 4 times 3 is 12, but when you divide that by 4, you're just back to 3. Equals 6 times 4, which is 24. Note that the 3 is still there, though. So to get rid of that 3, I need to divide it away, because it's 3 times x, and the opposite of multiplying is dividing. 3 divided by 3 is 1, therefore x is 24 divided by 3, which is 8. X is 8. Another thing to note here is that this one was written 3x divided by 4, which is the same as 3 divided by 4 x's. You can write the x right next to the 3 on top, or you can just write it next to the fraction. So these mean the same thing. To get rid of it, you still do the same thing. You times by the 4 first to get rid of the bottom, and then you'll just be left with the 3, like over here, that you end up dividing away.